if we can have folks introduce themselves, I like to do it consent or popcorn style. Who you are, your name, anything else that you would like to share with folks in the circle and or the attendees. I'll turn my mic off and create an opportunity for folks to introduce themselves. Any work that you're doing, any place that you're working, paid or unpaid, connections to community, and non-gender diverse folks.
So kikyet hukakli kiwakas nohus, hukakli kankomeknel ksok, hukakli Smokii Sumac. Huneni Ktunaxa. Hi, I am Smokii. I am Ktunaxa. I introduced you by a couple names there. One of them is my 3 times great-grandfather. His name was Abel Morningstar. And I currently have moved home, and I just bought a house. So I'm moving tomorrow. So I just want, and I share that because as a trans person and an Indigenous person, like, I bought a house. One of my uncles went with a mortgage, right? So I just want to share that. That's where I'm at today. Very happy to be home in a Ktunaxa. So I'll be living in a tiny little settlement called Wardener, but it's right out near Cranbrook, British Columbia. And I'm grateful to be here today, and I'm thinking of all our relatives, and very happy to have. I was gone for about a decade, so now I live at home and I'm working in my nation. So I'm the Senior Manager of Education and Employment for the Ktunaxa Nation Council. And I'd like to tag Kai. With consent, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, of course. Anin kinagoya make the benes and deshnikas, make is in dotem. We just quick magin donjapa Champaign, Illinois, in the Nongwa. So I am Kai. I use they, them pronouns. And I've introduced myself in Anishinaabe moin. I guess I can also say Tanche, Minosh, Dishnika Ashon, and Mechifnia Mina. So I'm also Métis. My grandma's mother was from Winnipeg, and her father was from Sault Ste. Marie. He's from the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. And so I count both of those nations as part of myself. I originally am from Green Bay, Wisconsin. It's where I grew up. I have long-standing family and community ties there. But I'm currently in Champaign, Illinois, where I am a postdoctoral fellow, I guess is my fancy title. And yeah, I'm also a language teacher. I teach the Michif. I've been teaching the Michif language so this year for the first time through an organization in Manitoba. And I'm a longtime learner of Anishinaabe one as well. So those are things that I always consider important to mention. So yeah, miigwech, masi. I will popcorn to Sandy if that's okay.
That is absolutely okay. Thank you. I just want to acknowledge that I'm on Kabi land. So not my land. I'm a Wiradjuri, so different land, transgender non-binary person. Wiradjuri, where I come from, is geographically one of the largest Aboriginal countries in this so-called continent of Australia. So I use they, them, and Gwyn pronouns. Gwyn is a pronoun that we use in Wiradjuri, and it's completely outside of the binary, and it's used for all people. So I'm a professor of Indigenous Studies at Macquarie University. I work which is on Darug land in the area that's now known as Sydney. I work in the Department of Indigenous Studies and across the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures. So the work I'm doing, I won't go into massive detail about it, but I'm basically a 2020 to 2024 Australian Research Council Future Fellow, which sort of the most senior academics go into one level of it, which I'm at, which means I basically get bored out for 4 years to be able to work on a major research project, which is called Saving Lives, Mapping the Influence and Power of Indigenous LGBTIQ+ creative artists. So it's looking at the unique contribution, but also just the influence of queer artists across our communities in relation to well-being, but in relation to everything, actually. And I also just recently completed another major ARC research project that went for 10 years, which was looking at First Nations peoples across 470 museums and keeping places, which was a lot of fun and really awful all at the same time, as these things are. So I've been an academic for 30 years, and my kind of trajectory, I suppose, is to continue to do the work with my amazing colleagues. I have to say half of my colleagues in my department, and that's an Indigenous Studies department, are trans non-binary. Thanks. I'm tagging Raven.
Miigwech Sandy, Bojo, Indishnakas, Mishkekinoden, Makododem, Michisagik Nindishnaba. Hello, my name is Raven. I'm so happy to be here with you all. I'm just like literally glowing with pride. Also just acknowledging Percy and their new success as a now doctor. Lezard, so very grateful for that. So I'm just a little, I'm fanning. I'm fanning right now. I go by they, them pronouns. I was born and raised in Toronto in Mississauga territory and lived and worked for many years in community as an elders helper, as a cultural worker for Native Child and Family Services, for a street outreach worker for Anishinaabe Health. I'm also a parent of 3 incredible humans. And my eldest is 24. My middle son, they all self-identify as sons, as males, is 21, and my youngest will be 18. I have a pretty solid art practice. I do a lot of different types of art, filmmaking, performance, visual art. I also do a lot of speaking. And right now I'm working on a project for the Transgender Law Center in the US for trans, it's a disability project for trans folks and Two-Spirit folks. And I also sit on the subcommittee for MMIW2S with Percy. And yeah, just I do a lot of different things. The rest of it is all just Sandy. I was kind of blown away by your intro. So I'm just like, what can I say really? I mean, I'm here. I'm grateful to be here. There's a reason why I'm here. And there's a reason why we're all here, because we all have some pretty brilliant things that we offer our communities. And so, yeah, just grateful to be in conversation with you all. Miigwech.
Charlotte, I just love how they're living their best life. They get to live their best life as an elder, knowledge keeper, right? Hold us youngins in place until they come back. Why Iskris, Percy and Chechen, Lezard, and give, before anything else is said, we see who we are. My name is Percy, and the name that was given to me by the life givers in my community is the wolf. So any wolf clan, we are siblings. You're always welcome into my den. If you want to come in, you're always welcome into my circle. And I'll always provide a place and space for anyone else who's not wolf, but as a relative. You're always welcome to my fire as a fire keeper, into my home, whether it's on my homelands or where I continue to be a guest on the territories of the Nishnaabe, Haudenosaunee, Cree, Huron-Wendat, and the Three Fire Confederacy. What am I doing? Oh, I am the chair of Indigenous Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. I recently successfully defended my dissertation, which is about the abolition of social work as a Two-Spirit Minim Chilix person. And Minim Chilix is the word that I've had the language speakers who speak in Jilkin define the words for me, because I'm not interested in participating willingly on hetero painting or pink washing our communities any further. So I pushed our people to find the words in our language for me and who I am in the world. I wanted to, now that I'm in an institution and I have alleged power in this system and structure, want to center the voices that there's a huge gap of Indigenous, Indigiqueer, Two-Spirit, gender diverse voices on a wide variety of topics. And you folks have generously risen to the call or the ow that I did. And you've wanted to come and sit in council fire with me, separate from the institution. And I also wanted to raise up the voices of folks who have not always been asked, and not privileging cisgendered Two-Spirit folks, because I think there continues to always be it's conflated, a Two-Spirit identity and gender diversity. And so I wanted to show the brilliance and the gifts of our gender diverse relatives from an affirming place and from raising each other up. Because I also did not want to willingly participate in perpetuating the tropes attached to an Indigenous gender diverse identity. We're not just trauma, we're resilient, we are resurging, we are gifts, and we are the future. So yes. Yeah, I'm going to center Indigenous speaking people that have been here, not as arrivants, as settlers. I'm just looking at the chat. I'm going to center Indigenous people. I get, and if there's another official Canadian language I'm going to support, it's going to be in Nuktuk. So just to speak to that comment in the chat. So I'm going to invite folks to comment, and I think I'll call on somebody because I think we're being too nice to each other, and I want to respect our time. If folks could share, what does it mean to be Indigenous and gender diverse, and what does Trans Day Remembrance mean for you? And I want to, for my relatives and kin from the South Pacific, there might be names of relatives that you know who might be mentioned as a trigger warning, content warning for you folks, because I've been lovingly reminded that I recognize I'm in the context is Canada, but indigeneity is a global. It's global. And the practices, again, are not just how we, as First Nations, Métis, Inuit, Afro-Indigenous, Black Indigenous folks in the context of Canada, mark. So to my relatives and kin in the South Pacific, there will be names and people who have gone on to the spirit world that you might hear. So again, I invite you to answer these things in the chat, and I will turn my mic off and I will invite Raven.
I'm first. Wow, some pretty incredible questions. Oh, where did they go? In the chat. Thank you, Percy. I think for me, to be Indigenous and gender diverse is brilliance, is acceptance, is validation, is connection, is opportunity to reclaim our languages and figure out what these identities look and feel like in song, in ceremony, in dance, in our art we make. Just so much opportunity there, and honoring that we're not the first ones, you know, that there were gender diverse ancestors for hundreds and hundreds of years, and just really sitting with that and honoring what they went through, what they must have gone through. To be Indigenous and gender diverse, I think also is a tribute. It's a tribute to our ancestors. Do you want me to go down all the questions, Percy, or just one at a time?
What does this date mean to you? And then you can pass it off to somebody else.
Yeah. You know, first I started writing QSTDOR, and I recently made a graphic today. I may post it later. That says, we're not under your umbrella, you're in our lodge. So just like grounding in that, that we're not an asterisk or, you know, just an acronym, that we have a completely different understanding of gender in our communities, and like so diverse across the board throughout all of Turtle Island. So, I mean, globally, obviously, Indigenous concepts and theories and ways of knowing of gender globally, they're just vastly different than just the trans umbrella, and they include a lot more. So it does give us an opportunity to remember people that have passed away, people that have been taken in violence. It also reminds me of the violence, domestic violence, being trans, being a parent, that there's a slow, sometimes slow, there's a slow passing of those people that we can't hold and we can't protect, that it's not just immediate, that it could happen over time. Yeah, and thank you, Percy. That's what I have to say. Thanks. I'll pass it to Kai.
So I've been thinking about this question, the first question all day, of what does it mean to me to be Indigenous and gender diverse? And I am like, I don't even know how to answer that question. The thing that's coming to my mind right now is time, like in the sense of, I'm a big history nerd. I literally wrote my entire dissertation on like looking for how Anishinaabe, Two-Spirit, and especially trans and gender diverse people look for history of folks like us. And so that's always really important to me, is like thinking about is like the knowledge that we have this long history. But I'm also a big nerd about science fiction and Indigenous futurisms. And so another part of what I think is something important to me about being Indigenous and gender diverse is the knowledge that we have a huge, long future ahead of us that we can create however we can possibly imagine. I am in the last stages right now of editing a zine of art and writing by Anishinaabe Two-Spirit people. And I was just writing the like sort of forward note to it. And I was listing off some of the names that we have as Anishinaabe Two-Spirit people for gender and sexual diversity that I have learned. And I ended it by saying, so we have these terms, some of them are old, some of them are more recent, and in the future, there may be yet more that we haven't even imagined yet. And so I think that's, to me, a big part of it, is that I want to think about like how we can bring together all of these different times and bring them into the present with us. Yeah. And in terms of the day of Transgender Day of Remembrance, it's something that when I was a teenager, I was living in Green Bay, which is a small city in the upper Midwest, right on the Great Lakes. And it's a mostly white city. And I was in community with a lot of other LGBTQ folks, but not a lot of queer and trans folks of color. There was like just a couple of us in the community. I didn't know any other Indigenous trans people or really Indigenous LGBTQ people at all at that point. And so I didn't really at that moment understand why Transgender Day of Remembrance was this thing that we collectively did. Like it was something that felt like we did it every year as this sort of community, but it wasn't hitting home because in some ways the people who were most affected weren't being centered. And then I moved to Chicago and for college, and got involved with a wonderful group that is called Soy Quien Soy, which was mostly Latinx trans folks, but was open to trans people of any background. And being in community with those folks and experiencing the loss of trans women in the community that I was in really changed my entire way of experiencing Transgender Day of Remembrance. And so I think it's still complicated for me in terms of, you know, I have this academic brain that kind of, or the discourse brain, you know, I see everyone gets on Twitter and is like, has an opinion about, should we even do this day? Should we make more of it? But I think it's important, but I also don't want it to ever be the only day that we have. So I think that's what I will say on that. Yeah. Are we still popcorning? Okay. I will popcorn to Smokii this time.
Thanks, Kai. What does it mean to be Indigenous, to be Ktunaxa and Two-Spirit, to be trans and Two-Spirit? I think what I often do talks and I tell all sorts of stories, but I think the one that I want to tell today is that I came home. I've been praying for a long time to come home. I went for help from the late Carol Edelman Warrior and Dr. Shawano Uran, Dr. Carol Edelman Warrior and Dr. Shawano Uran. Shawano teaches at Bemidji now, but I went to them for help and I prayed, I want to just help me come home, help me come home. I didn't know that it would mean to come home in my body in a different way. I remember one time praying to find my voice, and I meant I want the songs. And it wasn't until I started testosterone and started to sing as in this new voice, which is actually super funny because when I was transitioning, most people were like, but your voice, because I played music and sang. And so and I was like, no, when I found out my voice would change, that was the reason. That was like, get me on the tee. And so it's funny, I've heard be specific in your prayers, not too specific, but be specific, be aware. We always say, can the spirits metaphor? Can the spirits spell? And it's actually, that's another funny moment about my name where my mom said, I don't know, they didn't spell it. They just told me Smokii. But I'm sharing this just because I think I prayed to come home. And a couple years ago, Dr. Christopher Horsethief, who is a Ktunaxa PhD and incredible scholar. If Christopher Horsley, if you can search him, and he has some TED Talks and stuff. So really, really great. But I was coming down for our New Year's ceremonies, and I had come a couple of times with my auntie. They had brought me home, and then he was like, "Wait, are you coming down? Can we have coffee?" And I was like, "Yes." And I'm terrified because Christopher's PhD manuscript was on like complex systems theory, and when I opened it and I read the first chapter, I was like, I felt so stupid. Like my stuff was triggered, and I went, "I'm almost a PhD, and I don't understand any of this." Then I watched his TED Talk and was like, "How come we're actually cousins?" I call him uncle now. But I was like, how come we aren't best friends? Like, he's punk rock, he snowboards, like all these things. It was actually super funny listening. And I went, we do the same work. So we start talking, and I'm talking about gender stuff, and I'm talking about what I do because I have just come out. And he's like, yeah, I'm going to talk to the old people about that soon. And I was like, when? What? And he's like, I need to talk to them about gender. And I was like, when? So I book a flight. It was like February. So I book a flight, I come down. And as our uncles do, he goes, all right, I got to go take a couple calls. So, and I'm sitting there with 20 language speakers and elders who I haven't been around. I used to say I don't have Ktunaxa elders after my grandma passed. And we start talking, and I start talking about two-spirit and being two-spirit. And I'm nervous, and I'm not looking, and anyone who's worked with elders knows, like, you have to look straight in the eye, you have to talk loudly. And so I'm going there, I'm talking away, and they're going, what is he talking about? Then finally the other one goes, it means gay. And it was like my favorite, like, yelling whisper of the elder. And then the late Herman Alpine, he started speaking, and he said, you know, I used to think I was that way. He said, after everything that happened to me in the residential schools, I used to think I was that way. And he goes, I had a really hard time, a lot of shame around that. And then he said he went to a conference in Vancouver, and he saw someone talking about two-spirit. And he said he sort of shared a little bit about what they talked, and that we were spiritual and we lived beside leaders and all these kind of things. And as he's saying this, one of the old women is like, and I start panicking. I'm like, okay, you know, the red flag, all the like trauma body goes in, and I'm like, okay, let's see what happens. But they have very specific, we have specific protocols and practices. So Herman got to finish his story. And then I said, okay, Dorothy, who's a cousin, they're connected. And I said, would you like to speak? And I was really like, okay, here it is. I'm home, and I know two-spirit people have been kicked out of the community. I know all these things. And she went, it's not like that. You're not special. You're just Ktunaxa. And in that moment, I was like, I still carry that as one of the most important moments that I've had. Because to me, it was, you are part of this nation. And what I've learned is that in my language, we don't have pronouns, but we use names, and the name matters the most. And what you do matters the most. They don't care necessarily. And I shouldn't say that it's not all happy and wonderful, but in general, like, having lived in Anishinaabe territory with skirt protocols and all kinds of stuff, it's not, we're very privileged here to not have to deal with that. So I just wanted to share that one, because to me, it's like, I'm just Ktunaxa. And I was at an event one time where someone was saying queerness has existed on this land for so long. And I sort of went, that's actually not true, because we weren't queer. We weren't weird. We are the land, right? And so when I say weird and queer, I mean, I think I also call myself queer and Indiqueer. And so labels are fluid, and I'm not saying don't use that, but I am saying that when we're talking about pre-contact and we use the term queer, I don't think we can. I think we need to be more, and I think Kai's research talks about this. So I wanted to just share that story, that to me, it's like, I'm Ktunaxa, and it means, that's what it means. I'm not special, I'm just Ktunaxa, and I have a role here, and I have things to do. But I also was taught that it was taboo, that we're here to sort of push, we can say the taboo things, which I love. So thank you to Nasuke and Alfred Joseph, who told me that, because now I just use that all the time when I'm like, I'm going to say something that's going to shock you, but it's because I'm two-spirit. So, you know, when I'm in certain audiences, it kind of helps. I can sort of do that. The other space that I wanted to say is that to me, it means I'm more open. So I don't know, yesterday and the day before with all the flooding and everything, my energy was just vibrating, and trying to explain that to my staff. I was like, you know, I negotiated a door at an office in my job so that I could close the door. So I always thought I was more open to always energy coming in. But Nisuk and Alfred Joseph, he lives pretty far off the highway. And he said one time, he said, well, do you know where I live? And he said, what I think, he's like, when I think about being this way, he's like, people will drive by on the highway and they will know whether they can come visit or not. And that was the first time that I was like, oh, we also put it out bigger. I knew that we can't, I knew that I brought it in bigger, but I didn't really realize that when my energy and that kind of space, and so it started to make me understand my responsibility to my own energy as well, of how I'm paying attention to that. And so I just share that today about that, sort of what those things mean to me. Queer futures, like I found like maybe one of the, there's not many trans people where I live. I found one of them, we're making family, we bought a house together, right? This kind of, I realized that what I was going to do in my nation I had to protect my queer identity as much that I'm going to move it into my home and have what I need there. And when I go out into the front facing, I can handle more. And then I need my safe space at home where I can be just who I am. Those of you who know my poetry, it means I use prosthetics in sex. It means I have all kinds of fun that you can have too, even if you're cis and hetero, I promise. So check it out. And so I think really when I think about it, I think about all kinds of things. And to speak to Trans Day of Remembrance, I've only ever attended one, and it was in Nogojiwanong, and I had a very strong connection to that place and to the community there and to Trent University. And so I actually at that one offered to drum and sing. I will say that when I got there, I realized how heavy, like I took on a lot more there. This was back when I used to offer this a lot more. And now I understand why asking is so important, why waiting for people to come to me to ask rather than offering my energies. But I did do that there, and I started to learn a bit more about holding that space. And I do know that in that space, the songs and that kind of thing were really important. That said, when I think of this question of who I want to be remembered, I feel sad because I grew up in, and even now, there's not a lot of trans representation, not a lot of out trans people. And so when I think of this like remembrance, I sort of go like, there's all these, I feel like there's names I don't know. I feel like, and just to share it, like it's this kind of thing where I always knew I had a link to missing and murdered Indigenous women. I never knew the story. A couple of years ago, my auntie finally told me that my grandma was murdered, right? So these kind of things where I feel my transesters, I feel those names out there, I feel them, and I feel grief in this when I'm doing this Remembrance Day, because it doesn't, because I don't even have those names, because I don't have those connections. And I was just thinking, sitting in this Zoom, of how I'm emotional because I don't know that I've been in even a Zoom room with this many Indigenous gender diverse people. I think it's usually 2 or 3 of us. So this feels like a big deal for me. And I just wanted to share that. So thank you. I hope I didn't go too long. Thank you. Tajas.
Sandy?
Sorry, I was so engrossed. Thank you so much. What does it mean to be Indigenous and gender diverse? So just a note on terminology, we say black and blackfella here. So to describe Indigenous people. Indigenous is a word that we use, and it's there in a whole lot of my titles and the work and so on, but mostly I grew up saying Aboriginal or black. There's another couple of terms that kicked off a few years ago at a national level that have been used for a number of years, and it's sister girl and brother boy. So there's one community in particular, but there's a few communities around that community. We've got 300 different nations in this continent, so a couple is not everyone. But it started to become used by queer organisations to describe either trans-binary people or trans non-binary people. And that's not really how it's used in those spaces, but, you know, people were doing identification in that way, and that's great. People should be able to do that. I personally have a problem with it, mostly because it started to get applied to me. And I don't really need a double gender imposition that I wouldn't put on myself. And that was incredibly tricky, apart from the fact that clearly they're both kind of aimed at younger people, even though that's not how it's used in those communities. So there's a nuance to how it's used in the communities that use it, and it should be used in that way by them because they've developed it up, but it just became reapplied. And there was this obsession for white queer people to talk about sister girl, brother boy as this special terms that Aboriginal people use, and we should be using them. And so it became part of the list of who gets to be queer in this continent. And there is almost nothing more frustrating. So I guess I know that doesn't answer the question, but I think what it means to be Indigenous and gender diverse is to realise that the colonial project of gender just keeps trying to find these boxes, and it's fascinated by them. And, the Europeans did a number on their own people, got rid of these ideas of transness and pretended that they didn't exist there, and then came here and did it. So again, people are obsessed with trying to find or trying to work out why you can't find gender diversity in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in that kind of pre-invasion time. They didn't look for it. They didn't write it down. The colonial project means that the only things that matter are the things that people wrote down. We were decimated as a community, and all of our communities were decimated. And this notion that somehow it will have retained because, it's a noble savage idea stuff, it's a nonsense. But also my argument is always fundamentally, prove to me that people were cis. Prove it in Europe, prove it anywhere. And so I won't prove anything in terms of pre-invasion. And I suppose that's where I'm at with that negotiation, which is not what it is to be Indigenous and gender diverse. It's much more than that. It's lovely. It's getting to, it wasn't until I was in my 50s that I started to talk about it, but it was in the 1960s that I started to think about it, and that's a lot of people's experience, The reality for us in the 60s is that we were struggling with fundamental rights. So, it wasn't going to be, a space in which you could explore anything in terms of queerness. The resistance was really elsewhere, but of course people did. And so Transgender Day of Remembrance is about remembering those people who did and also those people who couldn't. And just recognizing the complexity of their lives. It's why I'm really glad I'm doing this project, but I'm doing it within our centre, which is called, it's just newly formed, called the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures. Our work is always focused on futures. Because of course it is, for all the reasons everyone said here today. Why wouldn't we be focused on the future? Because that allows us to recall the past, and it allows us to be in the moment now. And it allows us to consider the past and write our own pathways. But I love futures for one really crucial reason in Indigenous contexts. And it's because non-Indigenous people can't write our futures. Like, it's even on the nose for non-Indigenous people in the academy, where they love to do stuff on us. It's on the nose for them to be thinking about our futures. So, it's really agentic in that way. And so I guess, I get to work with amazing people, including Dr. Lezard, and, I'm who is a part of our centre, of course. And, is a part of the work that we hope to do. And I just work with these amazing people who make that process of being really wonderful, but the community at large and my family and, to a very large extent, the rest of the population are the tricky part. You know, they're the tricky part and they're the fantastic part. They're the part that makes sense. So it's very easy to kind of negotiate something in a workspace when you have a lot of power. I think I mentioned we've got like there's 8 of us in the department. You know, 6 are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. 1 person's Torres Strait Islander, and the 2 non-Indigenous people are in the most junior positions. That's great. You know, there is something in that, you know. But I think, again, going back to what it means to be Indigenous and gender diverse and outside of the binary in particular, I think what it means for me is not just a kind of truth and an honesty in this, but it's also a recognition that we've got to allow people to find their journey towards that, because almost everything, this is the top-down ongoing colonial project, almost every bit of funding that's been made available to First Nations peoples is binary gendered. And when it's binary gendered, it's often incredibly closed off and not inclusive of trans people who are in binary genders. And so it's about doing that work. And so I'm really, really grateful that I get to do that on a day-to-day basis. So people have seen maybe have seen some of the stuff that I've put out on Twitter. That's part of my work. And I'm really grateful to be able to do that stuff. So, yeah.
Charlotte, I know we've been in conversation, but I wanted to invite you to introduce yourself. And maybe speak a little bit about what it means to be Métis and gender diverse, and what this Trans Day of Remembrance means to you.
Okay. Danse, bonjour everyone. Ainista, Nipawis, Kapskauki, who is Koya, Equa, Mikusumis, the Tamet, Pempset, Equa, Charlotte, Kihuni Dodem, Red River Valley Dochin. Good evening, my relatives. My pronouns are she, her. And my journey as a trans woman covers over 50 years of my life. It wasn't though until 2017 that I completed the transition to Montreal and got to know a lot of my sisters across this country. And some of them are no longer with us. And we honor them at this time of the year. We honor those sisters who were brutally murdered, many of them, and also the ones that couldn't take the abuse, the violence, and decided to take their own lives. When we think of our trans sisters who are gone way too soon, it's a reminder of what humanity is really like. You know, humanity in some aspects likes to think we're in control of things. Many of these inhabitants are right, and they feel that people such as myself and my sisters and brothers, that we shouldn't be here on Mother Earth. So once a year, we take the time to honor, to commemorate those that we've lost over the last year. And last year, the numbers were 300 and something worldwide. And neighbors to the south had very high numbers, which is really alarming. People ask me why I don't go to states. Good reason. I wouldn't feel safe over there. But we take the time to remember our sisters. We take the time to honor them and to pray for them and pray for the ones that are here and struggling. I know in Winnipeg, which is a fairly large urban center, we have a lot of problems in regards to trans folks. Walk into the stores and we're being watched by security guards. We go to the counter, purchase something, we're being misgendered, and the looks of people as we walk by, it's, you know, it's disheartening. But for me, I like to think of this time of the year where I can honor my sisters from all over the world that we've lost, and to pray for them and pray for their families, even though it was some of their own families that threw them out. I did a presentation with Narcan, a federal group today, and it was on being trans and what my journey had been all about. And I shared with them some of the things I went through as a young woman in my early 20s and some of the problems I went through as an older woman in my 60s and 70s. And when I left, I explained to them, I said, you all need to take 5 to 10 minutes when you go home, stand in front of a mirror and repeat these 3 little words to that person that's standing there looking at you. I love you. Do not look right, do not look left, do not look up, do not look down, look straight into those eyes. One thing I've learned in life is that we can lie to our relatives. We can say, I love you, and not mean it. But when we're saying it to ourselves, we can't lie. We have to be able to look into our eyes. And from there, that love can extend to our relatives, wherever and whoever they may be. It's not a perfect world, you know. When I look back 50 years ago, how racist and bigoted Canada was at that time. And when we hear the words, the purge on the military people that, you know, were attacked because of who they were. We've moved forward to a place where it's okay to say who we are now. And people are starting to acknowledge who we are and allow us to be in their space. I've been a Sundancer for 19 years, and I know the difficulties I had at Sundance being trans and where my place was at Sundance. Some Sundances I wasn't allowed. The ones that I do participate with, and the one that we're going to create here in Manitoba is going to be for Two-Spirit people by Two-Spirit and allies. Time that we took back our lives. It's time that we stood up and said, we're here, we're not going away, you know? So it's going to take, you know, it took 50 years to get where we are today. It's going to take another to 100 years to get to a place where we are all feeling comfortable, where we are, you know, being who we are. So I want to thank all my brothers and sisters here tonight, you know, for your words. That if we speak up for our relatives, if we speak up for ourselves, change will happen. It's up to us to make that change happen. You know, the cis people, they'll talk about us, but they won't want to make the change. We will make the change. And I see that in our communities where we are getting stronger, we are getting more powerful, and we are creating the change that we need. Naskumten, Shimigwich, Marcy.
Cooks. I just want to clarify for folks in attendance and the panelists, what Elder Charlotte is talking about is that they were able to get land. So when we have institutions, whether they be in the helping sector, the governmental sector or the institutions of the academic industrial complex, when they do their land acknowledgements, they need to do land back. And so the local Michif folks and Two-Spirit people, I believe, in Manitoba were able to purchase land. And so this upcoming season, they will be able to host their first Sundance for trans people by trans people. So I just wanted to make that very clear when we talk about land acknowledgements, folks. And we have some folks here who are in positions of power in the helping sector and academic industrial complex. That means hashtag land back. So our people can have access to ceremony as defined by us. So that's what I want to bring clarity to. And I just want to change the way the last question for folks, because I want to create an opportunity for you to share some frustrations or some ways that non-Indigenous or non-Black, non-racialized folks can support us as community members in identifying some gaps and how they fail us as community members. So I'll put that in the chat for folks, and I would like to call upon Smokii.
Well, Husuki Skokni, for all your words, that makes me very happy and emotional. I was recently gifted something that's connected to Sundance, so I was like, oh, it's good to hear that stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think I say this stuff all the time, and it almost sometimes I just go, I feel like I'm talking into a void. But I mean, how I put this recently in my talks is that there is a crisis of self-awareness in whiteness and settler colonialism. So my biggest thing is that ceremony teaches us how to be in the world. Ceremony teaches us how to be in relation to each other. And when I say ceremony, I mean, I walked the dog this morning and that was my ceremony today. I mean that when we went to my new house, I just put some tobacco in the water, and that was it doesn't have to be the Sundance. It can, the simplest ceremony is just you talking to them. And so there's this space that I've learned, and in our language, I've learned this word aknusti, and we started using it for our land guardians. And then one of the old ladies laughed and went, oh no, that's a nosy woman. And we were like, what? And then, so I'm trying to put it together because I'm going, well, they told me it's like guardians, it's like watching. And then someone said, oh no, it's a midwife. And so we learned all these different ways of watching and between worlds and peeking out the blinds, and these women the woman and the auntie who knows everything in the community, right? And actually I have this young man working for me, and he sits on his deck and he watches everybody go by, and he's one of our Aknusti. And I said, it's perfect because it fits him. He knows everything that's going on. And so I've been thinking about that watching that we do in ceremony. So for example, one of the really important jobs is to keep the smudge going the whole time. Now, some people come to our ceremonies and they don't want to sit with the smudge. They want to be the sun dancer. They want to be the lodge leader. They want to be big. They want to be the pipe carrier, right? But what we have to pay attention is every single piece of those jobs, whether you're there to put the fire up, whether I'll never forget, there was one of my Sundance chiefs, he would say someone had to stay at home because we would stay at the house, and everyone would go, oh, I don't want to do that. I want to be out there. When I was finally asked to stay at the house, I was deeply honored for him to trust me with his house and with the kids and with cooking, which was a whole other thing. But I think so these kind of things of when we do this, it's about paying attention to what is happening. And so this is what's hard for me about dates for this kind of thing. It's like the 20th. Well, what happens when there's flooding on the 20th? What happens when, how do we do this? So for example, I usually do an ancestors feast on November 8th because it's a time when I had a friend who passed. And this time around, I wasn't able to do it. And I said, you know what, I'm going to do it in my new house. And we adapt. And this is where there's jokes about Indian time, that we're always late. But what I was taught is that it's not about, it's that there's this joke about it. but really it's the time isn't real. Your time isn't real. The colonial time clock, my partner calls it. But it's not. And so we've learned this in 2020 and 2021, because there are days and weeks that have gone by like this. And then I feel like the last, they stretch on into eternity, that spiral of time that's happening. And so I think about this, and I think we have to be paying attention to what is happening in our world. And so for me, when I think about events like this, and when I think about, all of it has been, I talk about it often as consent and mining. We're talking about mining in my territory a lot. So I feel like what settlers do to the land, they do to us, which is, I'm not the first person to say this. We all say it all the time. But I often feel like when people are coming to me that I'm getting mined for the resource, that you just want to take anything I say and then go and run with it. Often they want the resources from me so that they can take it and do it. And I go, it's not the way it works. We're very high context people. So, and when I say high context, I mean, there's a mountain here called Akinmi. In English, it's called Mount Baker. And I laughed when I realized it, because in Washington State, there's a huge Mount Baker. And in this one, it's just a little mountain from the Rockies. So it's a small one. But that kind of settler culture doesn't understand context. They go all over the world and name things after themselves. Whereas for us, we would not name another mountain Akinmi, because Akinmi is the arrows that went into that mountain for the creatures to go up. And that's when Thunderbird gave their feathers, and there's all these pieces to this story, and that is that place, and that is that space. And so when you're inviting Indigenous people into your space, or when you're trying to indigenize Trans Day of Remembrance, or you're trying to do this kind of work, like the other day I spoke to educators, and somebody said, how am I supposed to do this? And I said, well, you're kind of screwed. You're in a system that isn't made for Indigenous success. And you're trying to ask me how to help Indigenous people succeed in a system not designed for us. So I don't know what to tell you. You have to burn the whole system down. And so I think when it comes to these events, and it's not saying don't invite us, but it's saying that awareness. Do you know the Indigenous person you've invited? Have you spent any time with them? Do you understand the needs? Do you understand the protocols? I get asked sometimes right in the moment where they're going, should I do this or should I do that? And I can be generous and compassionate most of the time. But I think that there's a space where people think, oh, we need indigeneity here. I'll close on one other thing where I was speaking to mental health professionals, and one of the women said, well, I'm just hoping to be culturally competent in grief. A settler white woman who was works for our nation, works for our social work. So she said, I want to be culturally competent in grief. And I said, oh, so you want to run our funerals? And she was like, and I was like, the reason I can speak to grief is because I have helped 2 people pass, and I have carried their families through that entire year, and been at those feasts and sat by the body, and all of those things, washed the bodies, right? And so I'm like, I've been in this space. If you want to be culturally competent, that means you will have a responsibility to us that you are not ready to hold. So you don't get the knowledge until you have earned the right to share. And when I'm saying this, if there's young Two-Spirit people, I don't want you to hear that and go, I didn't earn the right. You're welcome. I say this, I'm saying this for external. And when it comes to young people coming and being nervous, it's okay. And we will help you understand these things. We will help teach you. I just want to make that clear. But really it's the rights to do this. When I just want to say, Charlotte, I want to honor being a sun dancer for 19. Thank you. Thank you for the work you do for our people, for that sacrifice you make for our people. And so when I think of that, it's what we do, it's always sacrifice. It's always sacrifice. So my question is, when you're trying to change these events, what are you willing to sacrifice for whatever it is that you're creating, whatever space you're creating? And how do we, because we all have to do that together. I'm thinking of Billy Ray Belcourt now. To love is to say, I'm prepared to be devastated by you. That vulnerability, that space of saying, we have to risk it, right? We have to risk all of it and say, I'm nervous or I'm scared, or can you help? Or is it even appropriate for me to ask this? I actually love when people say, is it appropriate for me to ask this? Because I can say, no, but I'll answer it anyway. And don't ever ask that to anyone else, because because we have a trust here. But yeah, so that I think I've gone on enough here. And I did share a couple of things in the chat because my ADHD helps. I just am always bouncing on resources. So just so you know, that's what I'm doing. And thank you. I will, am I passing or did you have an order, Percy? Pass. Okay, I'll pass to Raven. Thank you.
Wow, Miigwech, Smokii. That was incredible. Yeah, I'm just really sitting with your comments around sacrifice and, you know, giving up something, making that space. And I think, you know, I've been very fortunate to both have a rural experience and an urban experience in terms of gender identity and inclusion and representation, all this kind of stuff. And there's, you know, the overarching issue is a lack of trust. It's a lack of trust with these organizations. It's a lack of trust with academia. You know, prioritizing how we prioritize who's at the podium, who's speaking, you know, what elders are we inviting in? You know, nobody's asking elders, well, do you have a doctorate, or, you know, do you have an MFA? We honor them and their knowledge that they carry and actually value it. So yeah, for me, it's about trust, you know, and it's about consistency and actually showing up, not necessarily bolting as soon as you make a mistake, but actually just staying there and being in that uncomfortable space and realizing that there could have been failure or a mistake, and that to repair it in a meaningful way is you actually have to work through that those feelings of being uncomfortable and anger. And yeah, I had an experience. I know, Charlotte, you brought up the purge, and you know, we're going to have a monument in Ottawa, National Monument, and that's one incident where you know, I was brought on to that team, one of the teams that were submitting their application to do that monument. And, you know, I thought that this would be it. Like, that would be amazing to be able to work on a national monument about the purge, and also just grounding it in that at the same time the purge was happening, like absolute segregation and legislation against Indigenous people across the country was happening at the same time. And what does that look like? And how can we honor these things together without just upholding the military and upholding the police, RCMP, and the government? And so I was asked to be a part of it. And I thought I was going in as an artist, and that was soon clarified that I wasn't. And then I was asked to do a presentation on being Two-Spirit. And what does that mean? Because it's a LGBTQIA2S monument, they need to have some Indigenous representation. And so what it turned out, my colleague and I, who I was working with, we were the only two visibly racialized trans and queer people on this team that had community connection. And what happened was I was told by my peer that the only thing that I'd be doing in this project would be this 1.5 hour presentation. And then that's it. And then I would be asked to not be a part of the project anymore. And when we're considering these monuments and how we're working with community and, you know, what they're representing, this particular team went ahead and designed, you know, their proposed design. And in it, they included the 7 grandfather teachings. And it's quite upsetting because a lot of organizations pick little things, pick what they want to represent, and pick the people who are easily digestible, who are gonna not say anything when you actually make a mistake. And they changed the 7 grandfather teachings to grandparent teachings. And I'd be interested to hear all your perspectives, but there's teachings that actually are grandfather teachings, and there's teachings that are grandmother teachings, and there's also teachings that are gender diverse teachings, two-spirit teachings. And to change that just for the look and feel of the neutrality of these teachings really bothers me. And so not only did they create harm by tokenizing my peer and I, but they're creating harm by starting something that hasn't been properly discussed in community, which is, do we change grandfather to grandparent? And so, additional harm is done. So ways organizations fail are sometimes with good intent. And I'm sure everyone has good intent in what they do. And I think that's where the ego comes in. When you do make a mistake, they're like, well, I actually just wanted to include two-spirit people, but they're not doing it in meaningful ways. I think organizations can do a lot more to protect Indigenous two-spirit trans sex workers, victims of, again, domestic violence, the trafficking of our children and our youth and our two-spirit folks. We're not doing enough. We're not doing enough to hold, the RCMP, the military, to account for what they're doing to our women and our two-spirit folks across this land. And whatever those organizations can do, whether it be to give land for ceremonies so that we can at least honor those who are missing and those who have been murdered in ceremony as a beginning. And I think the last thing would be to acknowledge that we have to do more work to include trans folks and two-spirit folks that are disabled identified, and that they have a space to speak and talk and be recognized and acknowledged. And I say that personally for myself. In a lot of organizations where trauma is brought up like it's lunchtime conversation, and you're sitting there having to listen to some pretty horrific things and not acknowledging that actually we have to do more work to look around who's in the room, what their lived experience might be. How would that affect them? Would they need a longer break in the afternoon? Like just basic humanity stuff. And Charlotte, again, you raise that point, we've are not seen as humans, objectified in those ways. So again, just a lot of meaningful representation and inclusion. And Percy, again, I'm thankful for this because I'm sitting amongst all of you and who teach in academia. And as many times as I'm in universities, I always feel like I don't know, because I don't have that accreditation. And there's something that just keeps me positioned where I'm trying to hold space for those people that don't have this opportunity, that don't feel articulate enough, that don't feel that they have the ability to just extract the research that they've done at the drop of a dime. So I'm here for those people, for all of our two-spirit and trans folks that don't have these opportunities to speak in these spaces and to be honored in that way. And when we say we're doing the work for them, when we're saying we're doing the work for people who have been incarcerated or who have been in the sex work industry, that they're actually in the room, that we're not talking about them, they're not talking about us like a research. that we're actually in the space, holding this space. So, miigwech.
Kai, Sandy.
Sorry, was that me?
Either or. Who would
Oh,
like
okay, I'll go. Sorry again, I was just so engrossed, I wasn't even thinking about what was happening next. I guess it must be really disturbing for all of you to hear that everything that you're talking about is what we experience here. I mean, obviously in different ways, but not many different ways. You know, it's mostly the same. And that's because the institutions are the same. You know, they're made to be the same, all of these institutions, the institutions of organizers, of the idea of inclusion, you know, whatever that is. I mean, what it is bringing us into the container that they made. So of course, inclusion isn't going to work. I was thinking a lot actually about the, you know, we've got, sorry to bring it back to the university, but the university is a weird space. And so it's a weird space that has to be negotiated, but it's all about events in a whole lot of different ways. And so, you know, we've got an Indigenous studies major that you can come to do, and there's 8 units in the major. And 2 of them are queer units, a second year and a third year unit. So you have to do those if you're doing the major. And they're focused on Indigenous queer studies. Now, we don't have queer studies otherwise at our university. We have gender studies, but you know, none of the areas that they cover off on really have a lot to do with the queer studies area. So we're it for the institution, but we're never called on. Because they can't quite comprehend it. So we're called on for public events, sure. You know, so if there's a day of, yeah, okay, so we're up for that. But we're not called on for the far more intricate work. It's people ask why all the time, but of course, how could you not have queer studies as a part of Indigenous studies? I mean, it's unfathomable not to, and yet almost nowhere does, you know, but of course we're going to centre out. And that decision was made by my cis-het colleague, Professor Bronwyn Carlson. And of course it was, you know, of course it was made by someone who saw the value, but also just believed very strongly that as an Aboriginal person, you know, she wanted to see exactly how we could talk about our futures and talk about our genuine, not inclusion, but presence. And, you know, and I think that that's the key to it. But these events, I mean, as blackfellas, we get asked to do events all the time, like all the time. But it really often is about a queer event that they try and shoehorn, you know, blackfellas into, or it becomes the idea of this indigenized element of some other kind of program, and then they don't quite know how to think about queerness, and so that's when they do the resolving to sister girl, brother boy. Oh, you're not either, then, you know, where do we fit you? And that's when that becomes so present. But you know, we face, and I'm not going to, you know, forecast that this is true for you all as well, but we face a lot of internal skirmishes as well. You know, there's not agreement on a lot of these things, and there shouldn't be. You know, that's right. But there is this idea that lack of agreement somehow diminishes the power, and we have to fight against that. We have to disagree with one another. We have to, you know, have these spaces that are safe but are, you know, troubled intentionally, and they're not always safe places to have, you know, whitefellas at, or non-Indigenous people at, or settlers at, and you know, that is a really, really tricky line. And you know, fundamentally, you have something like Sydney gay and lesbian Mardi Gras. So it's missing there. And it's, Mardi Gras was trans exclusive for a really long time. And it was Aboriginal inclusion that actually changed a whole lot of that work, that insisted on that. But that's not remembered. Like we're still seen as this kind of come in, you're welcome. Which is, I actually had a question in there about land back, because when we say land back, we mean hand it back, not we're going to buy it. It means returning it. And the land back process has been really complex, because I think like any of these insistences that we have, people see it, settlers in particular will see it as a zero-sum game. If we don't agree to this, they might not turn up. Okay, I don't expect you to hand the land back for me to turn up to this, but I do expect to keep saying it. And we all expect them to be doing this work outside of turning up at an event, which is, I guess, my fundamental thing that I'd be concerned about, is that these events, and I think this buys into what everyone said here, the idea of a day that can't be moved is problematic, because the world doesn't work that way, but their world does. Their world is fixed in these ideas. And so disrupting that is really the only way that we can do anything about it. And I've been posting stuff about, Trans Awareness Week. I know awareness is a really shitty term. I know that it's incredibly problematic, but, the reality is, I don't care if I don't care if settlers here read any of this stuff, actually. I mostly want Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to read it. I want blackfellas to kind of look at this and go, look, this is something that we have to think about. Anyway, well, thank you very much. And again, the one thing that I'd say about the inclusion stuff, in particular, that's their kind of idea, is that their alternative kind of okay, well, we'll let you do it. Why don't you go ahead and do it? Is interesting, because of course they've gotten the funding, they've got the support, they own the systems. So the notion of that as a kind of response that's enabling is something that is so complex that we actually can't tell them each time this. And so the more that we're able to say it in forums like this, and for people to be saying it back, and hearing it and understanding it, then that's going to be really powerful. Can I just take one moment just to say, if anybody out there is interested in doing a PhD, we have a funded international position that's available. We pay for flights, we pay for living expenses and so on. And it's on, we're looking for somebody who is interested in queer studies, and they don't have to be Indigenous. They do have to be interested, would prefer them to be Indigenous, but they have to be interested in diversities generally, and the D word, yeah. But they do, and you can hit me up if you're interested in that. Thank you.
Kai? Wow.
Yeah, I'm listening to everybody has been amazing, and I am trying to gather my thoughts together of how to answer this, because the truth is that I feel a lot of anger about when I think about the way that trans, Indigenous, gender diverse people are constantly, I hate the word invisibilized, because I feel like it's not strong enough. We're not invisible. We don't have like a magic Harry Potter cloak that makes us invisible. We're constantly being forcibly erased and forgotten, and people are consciously looking away from all these things that they don't want to think about. And so I will say, for me, and I want to acknowledge too that I'm based in the United States, and so a lot of like my feelings around this come from the intense level of just forced erasure that Indigenous people have in this country. We're not on the national agenda hardly at all, and there's many reasons for that. But in terms of like within Transgender Day of Remembrance, one thing that I think about a lot, there's a certain person in the United States who is often invoked within Trans Day of Remembrance, Brandon Tina, who was a young trans man who was murdered, I believe, in the early 90s. And there's a movie about him that has many problems, but that's also like sort of a beloved classic of queer and trans film. And a few years ago, based on a one-off comment in a terrible biography that tried to tell his story but was very sensationalistic, it mentions that his grandfather was quote unquote Sioux. So I started looking into this, and I learned that his grandfather was born on the Rosebud Reservation, and he was Lakota and Dakota. And so where the story and Brandon Tina's story has many like complications of how he was raised, and of course of being light-skinned, white passing and things like that. But I just think about how his story has been made this like poster child, which is a weird term to use, but it's like the story that everyone knows, and nobody knows that he was Indigenous. And it's just, to me, like such a terrible example of how our stories are not recognized. And I think that's just like, a few years ago, I started keeping a list of all the Indigenous trans people who I learned of who had been murdered, whether it was not necessarily just going like from this year, but I went searching back in the archives and trying to find as much as I could, because it's like things just get erased constantly. There was and in our communities too, our Native communities, we don't talk about it enough. One thing that I really like think about a lot is how much the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement and Trans Day of Remembrance are like a Venn diagram that comes together, because you know, within MMIW, people don't talk about trans women often being targeted. And within Trans Day of Remembrance, people don't talk about Indigenous people being targeted. And so it's like this cycle of erasure that needs to stop. And I care about within, you know, Trans Day of Remembrance on a national, international level. But for me, I'm much more focused these days on my community as an Indigenous person, the various communities that I'm part of. I just remember my first year of graduate school, I was taking Ojibwe language classes at the University of Minnesota. And there was a young Anishinaabe trans woman. It's to call her even, you know, a woman. She was like 18 years old. She was a teenager. And our teacher one day was like, oh, there's a language table that happens after, you know, on Wednesday nights or whatever at the community center. And at the end of class, this young woman went up to our teacher and said, I really want to attend the classes, but I don't know, is it safe for me to go there? And like, it just broke my heart, because the fact that our community spaces are not safe for all of us is unacceptable. And so yeah, I don't have a conclusion that's like well thought out, but I feel like awareness is like it's important, and like Sandy, like the work you're doing around that and what you said about like being focused on your community is like it's something that resonates a lot with me. But I feel like there has to be something beyond that, and I don't know what it is yet, and I hope we find it because we need it. So merci, miigwech.
Want to be respectful of people's time. I hope the generosity of the circle of folks here, for those in attendance, that you will carry and hold space and move forward in Munipamatsuan or Chak Chak, doing things in a good way. They've been exceptionally generous with folks who are part of the academic industrial complex, the social work industrial complex, the helping sectors, and on the land. Been very generous. Reflections are, again, this does not happen. And what I want the folks in attendance ask why. What has contributed to the constant and continual erasure of gender diverse folks? And what are the ways in which you're going to disrupt your own hashtag land back, space back, and true inclusion, discomfort, and decentering yourselves, and stop pinkwashing the experiences of Indigenous gender diverse folks. Because without the land, we are nothing. And if we're not here and situated, it's another erasure in violence. I want to thank everybody. Oh, yuck. Me. I want to thank everybody for coming. And I am going to be very full for a very long time. This fills my heart because my family and myself personally, even in the last 10 days, has lost 5 immediate family members. And one of those people who I want remembered is Vaughn, who was trans identified. They were trans and they lived their life and they were harmed. And I did my best to help them become an ancestor. And that's a person who I want remembered. And being here with you folks has been spirit feeding through a very dark time for me and my family and all my identities and how I am in the world. And so, again, if things come up for folks, if we can have that slide again, Sab, for folks to call, if something comes up, it may not be now. Things live in the body and get moved around and come to the surface. If you have not heard today, those in attendance and my relatives here in the circle, I see you. I value you. I love you. And I care about you. And I hold you. Kukukst. I'd like to invite Charlotte to close.
Yeah, halfway. Mount Time, see Mikey. Can I ask him to Mount Time? Can I ask him to for those words of acceptance and recognition that we heard beginning from relatives? Can I ask him to Kukunau Mosanals coming to sit with us and to help us find the words that we need to share with one another? Can I ask him to ski for our relatives, the four-leggeds, the winged ones, those that swim, those that crawl, the standing tall people, the Indiqueer, the rock people, Hasne, the people. I ask you, Creator, grandmothers, grandfathers, wrap your arms around my relatives this evening and help them convey the love from my home to theirs. And let them know that they're always in my prayers. I ask you, Creator, grandmothers, grandfathers, to be with all of our sisters and brothers we've lost violence. Let them know that we pray for them here. We love them. We miss them. I ask you, Creator, grandmothers, grandfathers, if I've forgotten anything, please accept them in my sound prayers. Takwasi. I ask him to chimigwich.
Kukuk Stanley. And I invite folks, if you have the capacity and not Zoom fatigued, December 9th, we will have another circle of folks sharing their experiences of what it means to be 2S LGBTQIA during COVID. Some people will share projects and ways that they're supporting their relatives. And I've done my best to be geographically representative, young folks, Afro-Indigenous, Black Indigenous. So with that, folks, enjoy the rest of your evening. Lemlamp for coming out, and Lemlamp to circle of folks, Charlotte, Smokii, Raven, Sandy, Kai, for joining us and sharing. Lemlamp.